floor is open to questions or comments. Yes, please.
Bridget from the British Embassy. I'd like to put the direct question to you. How optimistic are you about Afghanistan's future?
Well, if you're not optimistic, there is nothing to do in Afghanistan. That's my first answer. Secondary, I mean, having been in Afghanistan for 2 years already, and having seen the change which have been occurring, and talking to the people, especially in the eve of the Bonn conference, when they were so much concerned and worried about what will happen with Afghanistan after 2014, and having heard their views and recognition of the progress which I have cited in my introductory remarks, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that Afghanistan will be able to stand up on their feet. I am, as I noted in my speech too, I'm increasingly encouraged and hopeful that the region is getting around together to tackle the issues of common concern and the threat which emanates from the sanctuaries across the border, especially vis-a-vis Pakistan, between Pakistan and Afghanistan. But that hope can only be witnessed in the coming years if we, the international community, demonstrate staying power for the years to come beyond 2014. The gains which we are seeing now are still very fragile, and we cannot afford to make mistakes of 1989, when after the Soviet withdrawal, the West have turned the back and left Afghanistan on its own, and now we're dealing with the consequences. Yes, we're hopeful, but that hope will only materialize if we empower the Afghans, if we acknowledge, and that's what is happening as we speak, that they have to take a lead, but they will need to further be mentored and supported in the years to come. And that's what the Bonn conference have produced, when the foreign ministers of 82 or 85 countries, with international organizations present, have agreed on this mutual commitment for transformational decade from 2014 to 2024.
Thank you.
Alan Dukes, member of the Institute. Ambassador, you've spoken of, at various points, of issues of governance capacity, and clearly that's an issue to be dealt with at national level. Is there any work going on to develop governance capacity at subnational level?
Yep.
And in the event that there are talks with the Taliban, is there any recognition on that side that there is an issue of regional governance also?
Well, you know, we as international community, we've been very consistent since London conference, when the commitments were announced from the Afghan government. But I mean, unfortunately, we have not seen the consistency of the effort from the Afghan side, or even a genuine effort to address subnational governance. And that's why we, as we approach the conference in Tokyo, have agreed to readdress that issue with the Afghans in a way that they would understand the possible consequences. Because if there is no proper subnational governance in country, if there is no improvement in dealing with the corruption, in making future elections more transparent and inclusive, they will undermine. Government will lose support of not only of the population but also of international community. Having said this, I must note that indeed there are some steps undertaken by the Afghan government, especially by the Minister of Finance Akiwal, in channeling some funds through the provinces, empowering the governors, and that change has been occurring, not least that the Afghans are also learning by doing themselves. If 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, before Lisbon conference, I myself on behalf of 27 addressed the issue of subnational governance, I was met with pretty strong resistance by the most senior government officials, because there is a fear among some Afghans that by empowering subnational governance, you may pave the road to split of the country. And that fear is still very strong among some of them. Having said this, the transition process, and that's a beauty that people are open to the lessons learned, the transition process have really demonstrated how important it is to put in place subnational governance. The transition is not only about empowering Afghan security forces to take control of particular parts of Afghanistan, but also having institutions which would be able to deliver the services to the people on the ground, which isn't the case up till now. Now it's changing, and that's why the Minister of Finance launching several pilot projects on the ground, and hopefully that will pave the way for a more systematic approach in empowering the provinces. And there is a discussion taking place, a political discussion taking place among some of the political leaders of Afghanistan, that governors should not be, instead of the appointments by the president, they have to be elected by the people, by the provinces. So there is a debate taking place, and that provides another hopeful sign.
Thanks, Lynn. Mari Cross, member of the Institute. I suppose I should declare an interest as former PSC representative and somebody who was present at the first Tokyo conference in 2001 and trying not to get a sense of deja vu with another Tokyo conference coming up for Afghanistan also. And Master, one of the problems I think that had been encountered over the years was the question of coordination among all the various organisations and bodies and that were involved in Afghanistan, both military and civilian. This has always been a difficulty, understandably, I think, but I wanted to ask you whether you feel that progress has been made in this regard. And that just leads me on to a second sub-question about the military effort and the declaration of withdrawal of troops in 2014. What do the military feel they wish to have achieved by withdrawal, and do you feel that by flagging a date that this is perhaps somehow responsible for the Taliban's lack of wish to engage in talks, that they just sit it out and wait for everybody to leave?
Yeah. Well, first on the first question, without exaggeration, I would say I haven't seen as close and intimate and cooperative relationship between, among three main players: UNAMA, UN, ISAF, and European Union, as it is in Afghanistan. We not just, coordinate, but we on a weekly basis, but we are on a constant contact, literally every day. Although it's probably Afghanistan also provides a unique example when you have this kind of what we call sometimes a trinity arrangement. You have a UN special representative, you have NATO senior civilian representative, and you have EU special representative. Although we have different mandates, but we share the same objective. And that provides us, a teamwork spirit. Of course, I failed to mention the third and the biggest player is the United States on the ground, and they constitute, of course, the fourth major partner in our consultative and cooperative work. But although I will not exaggerate. I will not hide that we have sometimes differences, just because our emphasis of work are slightly different. But by all in all, I think we have a very good cooperation. Probably also factored by a situation on the ground that we all, exposed into the theater of operations. Concerning the military effort and what will they have achieved by 2014 and whether the date, is it good or bad? Well, first of all, it's a fact of life. 2014 is the end of transition. That was agreed in Lisbon by the heads of states of NATO and international community on the one hand, and President Karzai. I'll be honest, when I first heard about 2014, I expressed my personal doubts and concern that, bearing in mind, putting a kind of a date which may be defined artificially, not based on the ground, may not produce a good outcome. But the more I thought, and based on the situation on the ground, I think it was a useful commitment from both sides, because first and foremost, understandably, it sent a message to the taxpayers and politicians of the largest military alliance in the world military history of 51 coalition partner, that we're here not for good. Our boys and girls will come back. It sent a message to the Afghans that, guys, get act together, because we'll be leaving one day. And the third message, equally important, I think, was also to the insurgency. We are not occupiers here. We come here to help to build the foundations for peace, prosperity, and sustainable economic development, and we'll be leaving one day. And that's why in 2014, although by population at large was received as another turning point in terms of the West is turning the back and leaving, but it really played as a forceful factor towards the Afghan government to get act together and to assume greater responsibility to define the policies of economic sustainability, etc., etc. That hasn't been on the agenda before Bonn, for example. Now we're talking to President Karzai about the fiscal gap, what they're going to experience when the Americans and international community will leave at the end of 2014. We will not leave altogether. And that's what we're learning. We're learning together with the Afghans, thanks to the World Bank report, that if we leave in 2014, all in all, this country will collapse. 90% of budget income is coming from the services they provide to the ISF and the international community. You cannot leave this country in this state of affairs. So we do have to be responsible international players and acknowledge, as I said, that beyond 2014, Afghanistan, as it is fourth or fifth poorest country in the world, it will remain so for the considerable future, because developmental effect will be only seen after generational change. The Afghan security forces will require further training and mentoring beyond 2014, and that's why Americans are negotiating agreement on strategic partnership between Afghanistan and the US, and they will define whatever is going to be the agreement on what kind of size of military force, mainly in training and mentoring, they will retain, and we as European Union will retain our support developmental-wise, but also, I hope, through the continuous European Union's police mission presence in Afghanistan, training civilian police and the rule of law.
Just if I can follow up on Mary's question with respect to the Taliban, based on your contacts and discussions, what's their incentive structure to engage prior to 2014? What mitigates them against sort of sitting on their hands and just waiting for everybody to go and then relaunching their political military efforts?
Well, first of all, EU is not part of negotiations, so I do not negotiate with Taliban. That's my first confession. The second one is, yes, we do talk to the people, and from the south, former Taliban, representative leaders who are now back from Guantanamo in a house arrest or home arrest back in Kabul or elsewhere. I think all in all, there is a sense of tiredness of the 30 years of war. Having said this, one has to be honest and admit that the Taliban by itself is not that homogeneous network of insurgency. And as we know from the history of reconciliation, that will be a process and will take long years to come. You may see some people, which by now, over 3,800 former Taliban fighters have given up the arms and have joined the stream of reintegration program. There are some commanders who are getting in contact with the government and considering the terminating the fight, but it's I mean the ongoing fights and terrorist attacks still demonstrate that it's going to be a long process.
Sorry. Yes, sir.
Well, in many cases, the question was asked already and it has been pretty much answered. But if I could just maybe even just make a comment. Sorry, Derry Fitzgerald, Defence Forces. I have found that if we have to connect the Taliban and the Taliban's intention to everything that is done, and without connecting the Taliban's intention or having a clear visibility on the intention, it's going to be very, very difficult for the international parties to make any firm, hardline plan or proposal. And a lot of it is predicated on the work of the NTMA. A lot of it will be predicated on the capabilities that are developed by the Afghan forces themselves. Could you comment on that? Capabilities that are being developed as you look beyond 2014, particularly in that time frame, 2014, 2020?
Well, of course, I mean there is still a long way to go, and you know, we all acknowledge, and the European Union has been very consistent for the last few years in emphasizing the importance that we have to pay attention not for the quantity but for the quality of Afghan security forces, both the army and the police. And that's one. Secondly, the attrition rates have been diminishing. If 2 years ago it was still about 40%, now it's down to about 20%, which is still considerably high number. When I speak with UPOL trainers who specialize in civilian police training, they commend the graduates of the classes and the courses. So do the NTMA commanders. Having said this, it's clear that both because of fiscal problems and because of lack of sufficient number of mentors, both Afghan National Army and Afghan National Police will require further training and mentoring beyond 2014, and that's what is taking place as we speak. When under the leadership of NTMA, there is a review taking place on the size and the modalities of future training beyond 2014. And one more note, as a complement to Afghan National Police, in particular, you know, the riots which took place yesterday and a few days ago were dealt exclusively by Afghan security forces. There was no shot. There was no bullet shot by ISAF or international coalition members in defense of UNAMA, in defense of other international entities in across the country. That's pretty remarkable. I mean, surprisingly, I haven't seen yet the media, international media, which have quoted that.
Yes, sir.
Labadina.
Latvia's ambassador here. Could you give us some insight on the situation on combating the heroin production and creating an economic viable alternative to the farming of opioids?
Yeah, well, very good question. I think that's one of the causes why European Union and international community will have to retain presence in Afghanistan, so as to deal with poppy growing and with counter narcotics. I mean, it's a systematic. I mean, it requires a systematic approach. I mean, you know, in the course of 10 years, there were different methods applied in trying to eliminate the poppy growing, and it caused only in enlarging the insurgency and people joining insurgency rather than dealing or putting in place alternative crops. I mean, the answer is that the Afghans by themselves or international community in the Afghanistan alone will not deal that problem. Will not be able to deal with that problem. It will require regional efforts. It will require also efforts in the markets in our own countries, which are importing the narcotics from, which are produced in Afghanistan. I think it is, if I may dwell on this, I think drug trafficking is one of the areas where you see unanimous consensus among such a different countries, from the West to Iran, Central Asia to China, India and Pakistan. And that unanimity, from my point of view, has not been fully utilized by all of us, so as to put in place a common policy to deal in a more cohesive approach. We know the reasons, Iran and nuclear programs, etc. But that is something we need to address on regional level.
I'm Horst Siechler, member of the Institute. I have 3 questions. The first is follow on to the Taliban issue. You mentioned sometimes the term insurgents, which means more than just Taliban. From this, is there a really centralized organization of the Taliban which could be addressed, or is this still a vague composition of insurgents which claim to be Taliban, but maybe there's other interests, therefore difficult to include in peace talks? The second issue is also follow on to the economic questions. You mentioned there is hope of development of exploration of minerals. Is this really a prospect, or is this a theory that Afghanistan has a potential to become a provider of precious resources? And the third question relates to the international community. You mentioned how important it is that the regional players are involved. In the broader sense, regional players are also Russia, also transfer roads, also India to balance Pakistan, and on the horizon also China. Could you give some comments how these quasi-regional powers are involved, and are they supporting the international efforts? Are they pulling on the same strings as the international community? Thank you.
Thank you. That's pretty complex. Deserves another lecture. Well, on the first one, on Taliban insurgency, is it, as I tried to refer, is it homogeneous or not? I think you have a better expert than me in terms of Michael Sampler, who can respond to you in more detail. I know he's traveling now, and my best regards to him. But my sense is it is not as homogeneous as we perceive. We all know there is, Kuwait Ashura, Haqqani Network, Hizb Islami, and there is also, generational change. I can tell you, in my conversations with the late Professor Rabbani, the former president and chairman of the Peace Council, who was assassinated a few months ago, as you probably remember, we became very good friends. In fact, and we used to meet very often and discuss. And his main concern, himself, fighting during the times against the Soviets, and knowing some of the tribal leaders and the warlords among the Pashtuns and the Taliban, his main concern was, and I remember that the last meeting we had 2 days before he was killed, was that there is a generational change which has been occurring, not completed, but occurring among the leaders of some of the insurgency, which is not anymore in the same kind of mindset as the elder generation, and even probably less under control of some of the actors which we all believe are controlling them or financing. And that remark was then also echoed and followed by some other people who are more closely interlinked with insurgency. So that's one factor which has to be borne in mind. Second, on economic front, yes, Afghanistan, it sits on the gold mine, but not only on the gold mine. It literally sits on the mine, on the mines of lithium, oil, gas, gold, and coal. And you have first investment, Chinese. That's the answer to the third question. Indians, they come in, investing not only in the mining but also in railroads. So do the Afghans themselves. This Afghan Gold Corporation, which is working together with the JP Morgan to put in place a Western investment in the gold mine. Actually, you also have an Irish investment in Afghanistan. I was reminded by my friend who formed the Insurance Corporation of Afghanistan, and which is in part an Irish investment. The company, which in 3 years insured over 13 billion euros of risk. So you have your presence in Afghanistan, and he specifically asked me to convey thanks to the former ambassador in Tehran, Ambassador John Derry, who helped tremendously to facilitate the investment by the rapid support, getting the visa or something else. So if you know him, please convey thanks from the head of the Insurance Corporation of Afghanistan, Len DeLunas, who is by himself American-Lithuanian, which I learned, which is a nice touch. He also is, I think, Irish citizen, American-Irish citizen. So then that leads to the international regional players. Well, you mentioned Russia, India, China. India is very present and visible, and that causes concerns, in Pakistan. China is coming. China has a long view, and I think we need to encourage the Chinese to play a bigger role from my personal point of view in terms of economic development, but also in using all weather relations with Pakistan to shape a more conducive political environment for relations between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And Russia has learned the lessons from the past, is not visible, but is showing an increased interest to play a constructive role in economic cooperation. And especially their concern is counter-narcotics, where we're looking forward also to work with Russians, with Central Asian republics in addressing drug trafficking in a more systematic way. And you forgot to mention a big neighbor with the longest border, which is Iran, which is also playing its own role. But I wish we have a normal relations with Iran to deal with some of the issues which we are compelled with.
Sorry, I just in fact had the same question as the Latvian ambassador, but perhaps if you want to follow up a little bit more, if possible, it's on the economic side. So for normal poor Afghan people, I think the poppy production is for them their means of life, and it's very interesting for them probably to know that they have a goldman under their feet, but in fact, how will they in the end profit from this? So is there a view from the international community in this regard, or from the Afghan government to get people economically again?
Well, first of all, about 70% of the Afghans, 75% of the Afghans are indeed living out of the agriculture, but it's not only the poppy growing; it's also the fruits, the vegetables of Afghanistan have been very known in 30, 40 years ago. We as the EU were supporting the alternative crops across the country, and including in Kandahar, which I visited recently. But it will require, as I said, systematic approach, not only in dealing with the trade of narcotics, but also, as I said, if there is a market as it is, it's very hard to impose and to force Afghans to get rid of growing of the poppies. It's also about the precursors which they get into the country and produce narcotics. And I admit we need to have a more systematic and more robust approach, while understanding that not only the Afghans have to be blamed responsible for the drug trafficking.
I comment on a question, if I may, on the economic issues. It'll take a long time to turn a nation of farmers into miners. But it would seem to me, and we don't have to look very far for illustrations of how important it is, that if there is any large-scale development of minerals in Afghanistan, that to the very greatest extent possible, it should be controlled beneficially by Afghans. We have in Ireland, you may not know about it, we have one major issue going on about the exploitation of a natural resource, and we think we're a long way further developed than the Afghans, but it's still a major problem. But it would seem to me that that would be a major benefit, and to the extent that it can be done, continuing international aid should perhaps take, to a certain extent, the form of gifting to Afghanistan the basic infrastructure and capacity to exploit minerals themselves. The question is a bit more difficult. Are you really sure that you know the mind of the Afghan administrators and leaders that you're talking to? I've been reading a selection of the military memoirs from Afghanistan. There have been quite a lot over the last 10 years, at all levels, from the bottom to the commanders. And the common theme running through all of them is that, even up to the top commander level, they don't feel that they've made any connection whatever with the people they're dealing with. They can see the result of pacification, they can see the result of pushing back insurgency, but they don't know what the people think about it. And if I were an insurgent strategist, I would make sure that I had lots and lots of my young men, probably men, being trained for the army and police force, finding out what the tactics are going to be, and having them properly equipped to deal with it when the international community goes. To what extent do you feel, maybe an unfair question to ask, that we really know what's in the mind of the Afghan leaders as to what they're going to do when everybody else goes away?
Well, there are different leaders, and when you speak with them, some of them, I think, of some of their minds we know, because they speak consistently and clearly. When it comes what's going to happen after 2014, of some of the mindset we don't know. I mean, and especially those who are penetrating with suicidal attacks. I mean, every day or whatever. Thirdly, it's at the end of the day, it won't be us. It won't be international community who will bring the peace in Afghanistan. I mean, I think we have to be honest among ourselves and to define the limitations what we can do. I mean, we shouldn't expect, Ireland in the midst of Afghanistan. Afghanistan will never be Switzerland anytime soon, and we should not assert or aim to build a house or state for Afghans. What we can only do is really to help them to put the foundations, and then they have to do the house work by themselves. And I think that's one of the lessons, bitter lessons, which international community has drawn. After 10 years of presence in Afghanistan, it will be the Afghans. They will make a deal among themselves. That's mindset. That's the tradition of Afghan tribal communities, and they're going to. And the reduced presence of foreign troop levels may facilitate that. But there is, on the other hand, there is a strong constituency, a big constituency in the country, which feel the gains of the change. The youth going to the schools, the girls and women who have the voice to speak up and participate in economic and political life, who are most concerned about the repercussions of if Taliban would come back to power. I would assert, that's one of the reasons why we cannot leave this country by themselves. And I don't think you can. I think the changes are sufficiently profound not to allow the previous regime to come back to Afghanistan. On the first one, if I may just, regarding infrastructure and mineral wealth, there was both a Soviet study during 1980s, and which was reconfirmed by the American geological studies that indeed in Afghanistan territory there's around $3 trillion worth of mineral wealth. The problem is not only infrastructure but also human development. They have no expertise in mineral business, and that's why in mining as such, and that's why it will require training and investment coming first of all from other countries.
John?
Kieran Murphy, Department of Defence. Just going back, I suppose, to the security stuff. I mean, the 2014 started as a negative date. The economic and financial crisis, I mean, it's now the rush for the door, and everybody's watching each other to make sure they're not laughed out. I'm just wondering what your sense is in terms of that transition. I mean, if we look at the Balkans, we've been there for longer than we've been in Afghanistan. We've been developing the coastal security forces and so on and so forth for longer than we've been developing the Afghan National Army. And still we need to call in over-the-horizon forces when things go pear-shaped. And there seems to be no plan in Afghanistan that there will be an over-the-horizon force to reinforce the Afghans if things go pear-shaped. And the other part of it then is, I mean, we talk about what happened post-2014 with mentors and training and whatever. I mean, I probably doesn't fall within your remit, but in terms of discussions that you're having with ISAF and whatever, I mean, is there any sense of what security is going to be or what force protection is going to be? Because again, people who are thinking about maybe we might do something in that area have a large concern about relying on the Afghan National Army or the Afghan security forces to provide security for the personnel, and without the opportunity to see any reinforcement of those forces, if anything goes wrong. Just wondering what you think.
Yeah. Well, that's a very good question. And first of all, we are going through the numbers of both of the size of security force beyond 2014 and the budgetary implications. I won't disclose any secret because it was made public already in Bonn, in the margins of Bonn, through the World Bank's study that in 2014 Afghanistan government will face a fiscal gap of worth of around $6 billion annually, and that will cover both security forces, financial security forces, and economic reconstruction. So that's going to be an issue which we'll have to discuss in Chicago and in Tokyo, how we're going to address and how we'll help to build the Afghan capacity and economic development, which would, gradually assume the larger share of fiscal responsibility. When it comes to the posture of an international military force or training force presence in Afghanistan post-2014, as I mentioned, we're literally having discussions as we speak. Yesterday we had another meeting with NTMA, and it's also subject of agreement, of course, between the United States and Afghanistan, which is still under the discussion, and that will define, of course, the size and the depths and the forms of the largest players' presence in Afghanistan beyond 2014. Because, honestly, if we don't have a largest contributor in place, the rest of the training will be rather meaningless. Because they're taking the biggest bill. They're having the largest contribution in the country.
And finally, go on.
Neville Keary is my name. I'm a member of the Institute. Ambassador, I came here in the hope of learning something good about Afghanistan, and I would like to thank you for carrying us up to 2014 and to pay tribute to the huge diplomatic, military background, mentoring, all this effort you've described. But if you look at the situation in the eye of history, it seems to me that it's as doomed as all the previous things. Alan Dukes mentioned recent memoirs by military men, but if you read Churchill's early days, another account of disaster when Winston Churchill was on one of the British expeditions in Afghanistan. And then some of the things you've talked about post-2014 are absolutely frightening, because by all means we all hope something can be done about drugs. But look at the situation on America's doorstep in South America, Mexico, where huge resources have been piled in, and trouble upon trouble upon trouble. And anybody reading and trying to understand the current economic situation, when you hear references to gold mines and JP Morgan and insurance businesses, my heavens, it really looks an extraordinary picture. And I tried to understand where, in one of the conclusions, the questions, you said, and I profoundly agree with this, that the best hope is to let the Afghans run Afghanistan. And then you seem to say, but because certain things are likely, we can't really live with that. I see the thing just in historic terms of all these ventures from outsiders of one kind or another have just been disasters. And if we can get any kind of a decent, semi-clean exit by 2014, is the moral of history not just to call it a day?
A good assertion, but at what price? At what price tag? A price that we will, leave behind us. The gains and changes which occurred during the last 10 years in terms of the women's situation in the country, in terms of a new evolving regional paradigm which was encouraged and supported by international players, and the still underdeveloped Afghan security forces. As I said, if we leave 2014 in a scenario that we pack and leave, the country will break down. I do not advocate that we need to run the country, which is the case up till now to a large extent, because of real parallel structures that we have too many technical advisors, too many foreigners running alongside those the ministries, just because of the capacity, which is on the other hand is also necessary. But I'm also of the opinion if we leave, as you suggest, in 2014, everything for the Afghans, I think the country will break down, and that's why you will need to define this. Kind of fine line. To what extent will be playing a supportive role, and how the Afghans increasingly will take the lead by themselves and will shape a future of the country, including on the peace process.
So cut and run is not cost-free.
No, it's not cost-free. I think the repercussions would be disastrous.
One final question. Sorry, fuck one.
Sorry, just Ambassador Kosteni, thank you, Ambassador, for your observations. Just a general question, actually, to after 2 years, you said you have been in Afghanistan. The first thing is, how is time measured in Afghanistan? Because all the talk what we have here is very based on Western thinking and Western mindset. Is it, let's say, based on poppy season harvesting it? Is it on generations? Because 2014, it might not ring any bell. And the second thing is, we discussed what Afghans think, but in the 1980s it was President Reagan saying city on a hill, and then what was uniting Americans. Is there anything, let's say, village on a hill or something among the Afghans, what they see as the desired future of the country?
Yeah.
Is it going back to monarchy or something else?
Well, that's very good. That's a very good question. In fact, I mean, that's another positive outcome of the 2014 date. It's not just it forced Afghans to think. I mean, not only forced Afghans to get act together, but also injected a wave of conversations and formations of political movements. As we speak, there is a birth of new political parties, not just, I mean, as new foundations, but I mean, more coalitions of the political parties, which are positioning themselves for 2014 elections with their own defined vision of the country. And that's a positive one. The time, of course, has this different meaning in Afghanistan than for us. You know, the country has gone through 30 years of wars, I mean, through the conflicts, and they have a long-term view, which, I mean, is hard to reconcile with the political calendar of international community elections. And that's why we're facing that dilemma sometimes. But again, from my point of view, I mean, in order to, I mean, we cannot afford the mistakes of 1989. I mean, the sacrifice and the sufferings and the lives of the soldiers and civilians, which have left Afghanistan, I mean, it was not worth of that commitment. And if we don't want to see internal conflict re-emerging or even spreading into the regional one, and God forbid again becoming a source of the training and executing of international terrorist attacks from Afghanistan, I think we're determined to stay for some time beyond 2014, at least for another 10 years, with a pretty commensurate commitment.
Ambassador, thank you very much. Thank you all very much for your comments and questions. Certainly, in terms of the European External Action Service, your role is one of the toughest ones, I would think, in the next couple of years. And although your contract may end in 2014, one hopes your engagement stays very long thereafter. Can we thank Michael and your staff for getting you here? It's been long in the planning and much appreciated. We wish you every success, and we thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you.